Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another developer interview here on Game Wisdom, where you some of the art and science of games. My guest tonight, they are the lead designer from Nightwell Games, who their current project is Surradia and Art Retrospective. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too badly. But this is a kind of deduction style, like story-driven or adventure game. And we're going to be discussing that and kind of the challenges of creating a game around this kind of puzzle design. So please welcome to the cast, Gwen Katz. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it is great to have you on. Thanks again for reaching out, wanting to come on and chat about your game. And yeah, like to any developers watching, as I always say, I'm always looking for a guest for this series. So if you have a game you're working on, you just want to talk game dev or anything like that, please get in touch. But yeah, for people who miss it, we covered Surradia during the Cerebral Puzzle Showcase. And Gwen got to watch me get stumped on their game for about 40 minutes, but I think I did do decently in it at the end.
Which is extremely not the longest anyone has ever taken to solve that demo.
Thank you. But yeah, it's great to have you on. I'm sure we'll have some discussions. And for anyone watching this live or recorded, if you do have any questions for Gwen about the game or anything you'd like to say, let us know in the comments. So, to get the ball rolling with, could you talk a little bit about like who you are and what is your background when it comes to game dev?
I'm Gwen Katz, and I've kind of had a circuitous route into games. Yeah, I was still am a professional author, and during COVID, I decided to make learning Unity my pandemic project. So I got into Unity, and now I'm into Godot. So yeah, I like story-based games. I also like doing art. I like anything that's kind of thinky, puzzly, and engages your brain.
All right. And with Surradia, for people listening to us, could you give us like the elevator pitch for what the game is about?
Yeah, so this is a deduction style narrative game. It's about three magical artists who mysteriously vanish in the midst of World War II, and you have to go through their documents, their letters, their paintings, and find clues scattered throughout them to piece together the story of what happened to them. So yeah, if you enjoyed Return of the Obra Dinn, it's a similar type of game to that, but kind of bringing it into a kind of a different type of story and more of a narrative format rather than sort of a collection of moments.
Mm-hmm. And with Surradia, I was looking on Steam. So is this the second game that you've kind of released under Nightwell?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess so. You mentioned, of course, your background being a writer and author. So what kind of like inspired you to make Surradia more like this deduction style game?
Yeah, like a lot of my friends, we really enjoyed Obra Dinn, and then when Case of the Golden Idol dropped, one of my friends became a proselyte for this game. It was just, you got to play this game, right? And so a little group of us were like, these will probably be fun to write. Let's try writing some of these, just on paper. And my friends all quickly discovered these are really difficult puzzles to write. But I had this idea. Well, it was based on a short story I wrote. And I had this idea. It was already a short story that was in the format of a review of an art show, a fictional art show. So I was like, oh, this would work really well. It's already kind of told in these hints about what do we know about these people from their letters and documents and stuff that are exhibits in the show. I was like, well, that'd be really easy to kind of expand on, go into more detail, and actually get to see these artworks in the game.
Yeah. And I guess with like designing Surradia, like how long have you spent like working on the game for?
Well, I drafted these things on last year on paper, but then Thinky Games had this jam back in December that was the case of the Thinky Game Jam. It was for these kind of detective style deduction games, and so that was when I actually built it out. And I've been mostly polishing and refining it since then. I'm also working on some of the upcoming rooms.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you mentioned Curse of the Golden Isle, and that's another one I was thinking about before we started this chat. Like that and Obra Dinn are both like very fascinating games, and it kind of like I guess takes me to this like first question that I have for you. In terms, you mentioned a few minutes ago about the challenge of making puzzles in this style, and that is definitely something I want to like touch on for this cast because when we talk about kind of like puzzle design in adventure or action-driven games, most of the time it's either like an environmental puzzle or something that's kind of like a lock and key style, like the old school Monkey Island, LucasArts style adventure games. But deductive reasoning or deductive style puzzles require, I think, a lot more challenge in terms of, I guess, conveying information to the player. Because one of the things I've talked a lot about in terms of puzzle design is, I guess, like, what is the knowledge base of the person who's playing it? Like, if you put a puzzle detailing 19th century orchestras, yeah, someone who studied that, they'll know that right away. But if someone who's never listened to anything, they'll be like, what the heck is this? So, with like coming up with the puzzle design, the puzzle logic for Surradia, what was kind of like your thought process, or like, what were some like the challenges or things you had to think about when building these puzzles out?
Yeah, the knowledge base is a constant thing you have to keep in mind. Yeah, and part of the problem is creating puzzles that will either be trivially easy for people who have the specialized knowledge, but are fair puzzles for people who don't, or making puzzles that are only possible if you have the specialized knowledge and are impossible if you don't. And generally, I think the key part is to try not to make elements of the puzzle rely on that specialized knowledge. You can keep that in there as like flavor and stuff, but that at the end of the day, like I've got an upcoming room where you have to figure out like what type of paint the different artists use, and I'm working hard to make sure that room doesn't rely on knowledge about having used those types of paint, right? Like if you've ever painted in watercolor, you'll know, oh, the short-handled brushes are the watercolor brushes, but you shouldn't need to know that to solve the room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, that's like that challenge. That excuse me, you can have like it almost feels like you need to have like different tiers of clues in a game like this. So you can have like something that is so specific, but if you know like this background, it's just instantly okay. I know what this item is, but then you still need to have kind of like a breadcrumb almost for someone who doesn't know about paintbrushes or who doesn't know
Yeah.
about art to kind of figure out, okay, maybe it's kind of like this, that connects to this, and then, okay, I can get to like that same response, but it will take me a little bit longer.
Yeah, so I tried to fold as much as whenever there's that kind of contextual knowledge, I try to fold it then into like the documents and stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
for instance, like uh the newspaper article that's like the first document you see in room one,
Mm-hmm.
it originally said like the art circle in Montmartre, and it now says like the art circle in the famed arts district, Paris arts district of Montmartre.
Mm-hmm.
So for anyone who doesn't know where Montmartre is, I was sneaking that knowledge in so you can find it if you need it.
Mm-hmm. And I guess in terms of like difficulty, or like different tiers of difficulty in a game like this, what is kind of like the approach you're taking to like what is considered like an easy version of a puzzle versus a medium or hard version?
That's a really difficult thing to gauge
Mm-hmm.
because everyone makes different connections. So there will be clues that 9% of people get instantly, and then 10% of people just don't notice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the end of the day, I think the thing to remember is that like um, the difficulty is just concretely how much trouble people had with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
In practice. So if you have a clue in there that, technically contains the information and you can technically use to solve the puzzle, but nobody does, nobody successfully makes that connection, then that's an ineffective puzzle. That's something you need to change. And I've really found like you just have to iterate. You just have to run these through, put through these puzzles with different people and see what do people catch on to and what do they not.
Mm-hmm. And to keep with that challenge of kind of like the logic of it, another part about this that is kind of tricky is when you have kind of puzzles that build off of the other puzzles in the game.
Mm-hmm.
So from the example when we were playing the demo on the stream, was trying to figure out or piece together like the names of the various artists in the second room, and there's a lot of clues or things you can insinuate from that first room. But if you didn't notice that, or in my case, you brute force a few of the puzzles, you then run to that case where it's kind of like, I know step 1, I know step 3, but I have no idea what step 2 is, and that connection is not getting made.
Yeah. Room 2, I've actually taken down the difficulty a little bit because it was definitely tripping people up in Room 2. Yeah, I tried as much as possible to only have you need to follow the broad beats of the plot, the very broad, like, no, remember the main characters' names and remember, their general relationships to each other, like who's dating who and that kind of thing. And specifically, what I wanted to avoid was having like sneaky details in room 1 that you need to go back and spot in a later room, like somebody in the background of a photo or, some clue in a letter that doesn't mean anything in room 1, but then becomes crucially important, in room 3 or something. That was what I wanted to avoid. So ideally, the only thing that needs to carry through is just the main arc of the plot. But it is much more difficult than something like Obra Dinn, where basically every incident is unrelated to every other incident and don't need any knowledge from anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. And to kind of what we were just saying about like reducing the difficulty of a room, in terms of like playtesting and feedback, because this is another very challenging point for any developer, is trying to figure out, is this puzzle, just writing people aren't figuring out, or is it a case where this puzzle or this challenge is legitimately too much for the person? So I guess like from like watching people like me fumble around and I guess doing playtesting, like how are you deciding like what is something that is correct but may need like a little bit of adjusting versus something that needs to actually be like toned down in the game?
It has a lot to do with really how people respond. Yeah, like I used to play a lot of text adventures, and a friend who's a big text adventure person said, like, I consider a puzzle fair if I look up the walkthrough and it makes sense. So it has a lot to do with just, yeah, because sometimes people even get the answer but feel that like the way they had to get it wasn't fair. Like for instance, I originally had in that first room, I had a couple of names you could only get by process of elimination. They were just the name in the drop down that isn't used anywhere else and therefore has to belong to that last person. And people really felt like that was unfair. Even though they got it, right? They figured out like, well, the name Raymond isn't being used anywhere, so it must be this last guy. But they didn't feel like they should have to do that. So that's the kind of puzzle I just stopped doing that. Just got rid of having to process of elimination things from the drop downs and made it so that all the names are featured always in the puzzle.
And I think that's a really good point, not just in Surradia, but just in like general like puzzle logic, or even just in like any kind of game where you're kind of tasking the player to do something. If they feel like it's unfair, like even if I think that's a misconception a lot of developers have, that if someone gets through a puzzle or a difficult section, then that must automatically mean they enjoyed it. And it's not necessarily the case. You'll have people who will metaphorically bang their head against a wall for hours on end to get through a puzzle, beat a boss, whatever. But then if it didn't feel satisfying, they felt like they made me do all this and that was the solution. Right. Like, I feel like, and I've had this feeling in a lot of adventure games myself, or just like puzzle style games, where I just feel like if this puzzle annoyed the heck out of me and I hate it, then most likely there's going to be a puzzle 5 minutes, 20 rooms, 2 levels ahead that's probably going to annoy me as well. why should I keep playing at that point? And I had a case with trying out this horror game the other night for Next Fest. And again, for people watching this record, it'll probably be several weeks at this rate. But it frustrated the heck out of me just trying to do this puzzle. And at that point, I'm just like, I am not scared at all of this game anymore. I'm just pissed off at it. I don't want to play it anymore. And I said, well, I don't want to play it, so I turned it off. And I think it's also why for a lot of adventure games, especially kind of like puzzle or challenging game like this, we can see very high churn rates in these games of people just getting to that first, brick wall and just going, nope, done, white flag, never playing this again.
Yeah, well, I've heard like video game historians blaming just the crash of point and click adventures on these really, really arbitrary puzzles where you have to do something like use the monkey's tail as a crank handle. And whether you figured it out or not, when you hear what the answer is, you're just going, why should it be that? And yeah, I think that the key thing is like, these are supposed to be entertainment, so it's all about like the experience you get, the feeling you got from playing it. And ideally, a really hard puzzle, it can take you forever and be very frustrating while you're doing it. But ideally, you get the clue, you get it figured out, you solve the puzzle, and then you go like, I'm so smart, right? You go, you get that satisfying feeling of like, oh man, I figured out how it works. Versus the ones where you could have spent a long time on it. At the end, you feel more like, well, that just made me feel like I'm really stupid, right? That just made me feel like I was being expected to know something or put something together that you couldn't possibly expect me reasonably to do.
Yeah. And then when the person feels that way, then they just go, well, I don't want to play this game anymore because most likely another puzzle is going to stump me just as well as that one.
Right, why would they keep playing? Yeah. Why would they recommend it to their friends, right? Like,
and it's always like very tricky like that. So while you were talking, I looked up the achievement rates for the Case of the Golden Isle just because I was curious to see like how people sell through that, and it did not have as much churn as I expected. Like, there's of course people quitting the game as normal, but they got pretty reasonably far before kind of like the majority of people just had like a major like churn point where they just got hard stuck. And I think part of that is the other factor, and this is something like I've talked to a lot of like adventure game designers over the last few years about kind of like the actual adventure game market itself. That the people who find games like Surradia, like Obra Dinn, Wadget Eye games, and so on, like they're a very hardcore set of fans. Like they will typically push through those hard puzzles to see the story all the way through to the end. So they will oftentimes have like lower churn rates compared to say like a very challenging action game where a lot of people play it and then it goes from like 100 to 50 to 20 within like 2 hours. But like to what you were just saying in terms of like people recommending these games, that I think has been like one of the issues that the adventure game genre has had over like the last decade. Like, it feels like we haven't seen, like, adventure games have, like, that kind of mainstream breakout moment that we've seen with, like, the likes of roguelikes, deck builders, Souls-likes, any major game that, again, like, insert popular game here for people watching this in the future.
Yeah. It's definitely, especially this deduction type game, it's definitely, and I anticipate it continuing to be, a kind of hardcore niche market. And it can be hard to diversify that market because to do that, you functionally would need to make the puzzles a lot easier. And you can't have difficulty settings in a deduction puzzle, right? You'd have to just make an entire new room to make it easier. Other than things like onboard hinting and stuff. Yeah. But it is, as you said, also a very loyal audience. So yes, the people who are into those games, there's not very many of those games out there. They want to find them, they want to do them, they want to, get their money's worth and time's worth out of them. They want to solve those puzzles, and they really do. Yeah. in fact, that's really impressive for Case of the Golden Idol because it's completely linear. Like you had to solve each one to get the next one. You couldn't go back to something if you were stuck on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, kind of gets what we were talking about a few minutes ago with like that kind of progression of the story and of the puzzle logic. That if someone gets stuck on puzzle 3, they can't necessarily skip to puzzle 4 or 5, and they'll get those puzzles. If they can't figure out the connection and that previous one, they're not doing that. And I've seen that in all the kind of Zack Lakes that I played, Space Chem, and Fin Factory, and all those.
Yeah, and these narrative style games, another big obstacle when you're designing them is you can't rearrange the puzzles, right? They're all tied to plot beats that happened in chronological order. So I've had several that I thought were potentially really good puzzles, but they were too hard to have this early in the game, and I just had to scrap completely. And people said, like, there'd probably be a fair puzzle to put like in the last room. But it just had to appear here or nowhere, because that's just when that beat is happening.
Yep. And to that point, that's another aspect we see from a lot of narrative-driven games, is that there are people who will play these games strictly for the narrative. They're not interested in, hardcore difficulty, super action, mega puzzles, whatever you want to describe it as. They're just here because they're curious about that story. And we've seen developers kind of have that trouble between wanting to make the gameplay the major point of the experience versus giving something for people who aren't, the best at deductive reasoning or the best at Souls-like games or whatever, and going, can we appeal to them in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, I do actually have an answer key for the whole demo on itch. Because during the jam, I really didn't want anyone, people aren't going to spend hours and hours during a jam. I really didn't want anyone to be locked out of finishing it because they were struggling with the puzzles. Yeah, I want people to be able to experience that story too. It's a story I really enjoy telling, and it's difficult with the puzzles. I think we're getting more of a sense of having onboard hinting and having things to assist you in there. But again, those are also really tricky to build, short of just having a thing that just gives you the answer built into the game. I'm still working on finding that balance myself, but I'll probably just tend towards adding assistive things that make it easier as we go along here.
And with a game like Surradia, is this a case where kind of like you figured out the story first and then you're building like the puzzles and the logic around that? Or did you come with more like the puzzle and the logic that you wanted to challenge the player first and then building the story around that?
This one was story first because it was a story that was previously published. Although the story is a very short piece, and so a bunch of the characters and stuff, like all the male characters, were not in that short story. They're all original to this one. But then I did also just spend a lot of time brainstorming, like what kinds of things would be fun puzzles. What about if we do a puzzle that involves colors? What if we do a puzzle that's like, who owns which cat? What if we do a puzzle with ages and you have to do stuff with math, like in those like little middle school like algebra problems they'd give you that were like, last year Alice was twice as old as Bob. And just thinking about when something strikes me that's like a mechanic that could go into one of those puzzles, I'm always trying to think about like, and where could we put this in? How could we, and when necessary, how can you bend the story to kind of go through that puzzle?
Yeah. And with kind of building like the different rooms, you mentioned a few minutes ago about trying to figure out like how to place a puzzle within like the point in the story. I was wondering if you could go a little bit more detail about kind of like that challenge as both the writer and the designer.
About like where in a chronology a certain puzzle should go.
Yeah, like kind of like fitting like a different puzzle or something you want to test the player on within the narrative and the pacing of the story.
Yeah, a lot of it just had to do with where I had, empty space, what rooms felt too thin, what felt like it just needed more going on. And then that's when I would think of like, hey, we could put something in here, like there's this divination scene in the third room, and that's an example of one that was purely just in there because like this room was feeling a little bit thin, so I'm going to stick in, and then we're going to rope it into like, oh, we can put a little foreshadowing here of like World War II is going to break out like a year later.
Right. And with the length of a game like this, that's always another challenge for like very narrative or very puzzle-driven games. Is that you'll have people who will kind of want, throw as many puzzles in as you want, make it as long as you want, or even longer than that. And you also have people who will kind of start to like feel burnt out after like the 5th, 7th, 10th room of puzzles and kind of this kind of logic. In terms of figuring out like the length you want in the game, now, of course, you said that this is based off of the story, so you have kind of the story as the framework for the pacing. But with like creating like the length of the game, what did you try, or what are you trying to settle on in terms of how long you want a game like this to be?
Yeah, I was sticking real close to a narrative arc for this. So I was definitely breaking this up into like a 3-act structure here of like, we're going to start with the puzzles where we introduce all the characters and kind of what do they want? Where are they in life? Where do they want to be in life? And then the middle part where we're going to have some, back and forth between them as they're kind of building their artistic reputations and deciding where they want to go in life and making stuff happen. And then the third act is the war act, right? When the war disrupts all this, how does it change everything? And how does it all come to a fore, as a person eventually will? But also, I just think there's a tendency now, like a lot of the games I play are just longer than I want them to be, even if I'm enjoying them, right? And that's one of the reasons I spend so much time in the indie space, because indie games are just way more likely to be the kind of game that's the length I would enjoy, right? Like I think like a good game length for me is something like 6 to 8 hours, right? And that's plenty of time for me to kind of get into it and enjoy it and, get some depth out of the gameplay and stuff. But then also like at some point it's friggin' over and I can move on to the next thing, and I'll move on to the next thing because I had a satisfying experience and it ended, and not because like I just got exhausted and gave up, right? Of course, it depends on the genre. Obviously, it's different for like roguelikes where, a run is half an hour and it's intended that you do it as many times as you want to.
Yeah, and the length is always, I think, another thing a lot of people tend to like misunderstand. Like, there are people who like games that can be 80, 100, 200 hours long. But
yeah.
But keeping like someone invested for that amount of time becomes extraordinarily difficult. And even then, like one of the things I've been like looking at with a lot of the games I've been studying is like, are people like leaving these games invested in the next one? Like if someone quits a game 10% of the way through, most likely they're not coming back for the next game. But if you can keep someone, again, 60, 70% all the way through, and even if they don't finish the game, they leave happily. Like going back to what we were saying earlier about solving a puzzle and figuring out, okay, I get what this puzzle was doing. Like I understand it. That I think is kind of what you need to do, not just like you here, but like you generally for people watching. That people want to leave a game feeling like they got something out of it. And if they leave too soon, or they just leave like frustrated, they hated the ending, whatever, they're not coming back.
Yeah. And you saw with like Kiss the Golden Idol, like when they dropped DLCs, that audience got really excited. It's like they had not had too much of this. They wanted more of this. And that's really where you want to end up.
And even with the DLCs, it's always hard, like in terms of knowing how many people are going to stick around, because that's another thing we see from a lot of the DLCs of any game, that the audience for that DLC is always going to be noticeably smaller than the people who bought the main game, because you're looking at people who actually finished the base game who will then maybe buy that DLC unless it comes, bundled in a, special edition and the year edition, etc.
Yeah. And then another issue with this type of puzzle specifically is just there's a limit to how many different ones you can make because every puzzle is fundamentally a different type of thing. So it's different than like if you're making a Sokoban and it's like lock pushing puzzles. Once I have the puzzle type, you can easily make 100 different block pushing puzzles, and they'll all be a little different. They'll all be fun to solve, but they're all fundamentally the same thing. And this is like that, right? We have things like you've guessed a lot of names in the first couple of rooms, but after that, you know people's names, and there's less of that, right? Like one puzzle that's like whose pet belongs to who, but you don't really want to do 12 rooms of whose pet belongs to who. You're always trying to we saw that in Golden Idol, where there's the one there's the dinner party murder, but there's also like some that are like figure out what the symbols mean, the magic symbols, what their meanings correspond to. And there's one that's like you have to do a bunch of math about people's ages and like how many infractions they committed and how many points each infraction was worth. And so you're always trying to think about like what's a different kind of puzzle that I could make within this framework. And yeah, your game is too long when you run out of different kinds of puzzles.
And we were just said about like someone can put together like hundreds of different kinds of box moving puzzles or any kind of puzzles. We oftentimes see a lot of these games also have noticeable churn when people are just like, okay, it's the 15th time that I have to move this box left to right again, and now I gotta move it right to left. And I think there is, like, to the point you were saying earlier about, like, indie games and the amount of time spent on them, that one of the major trends we've been seeing over the last, like, 5 to 7 years has been more games being released shorter, but being more qualitative, versus saying, okay, here's 800 crossword puzzles, do them all. Most people aren't going to have that time for it anymore.
Yeah, and maybe that's one of the reasons why there's such relatively low churn in these deduction games, is because it feels like you're constantly being presented with a new challenge. It doesn't feel like you're just rehashing the same thing you did in the previous room.
Yep. And with, I guess, the thing about, like, we were talking about main things, like, on the easier side, in terms of adding more challenge. Again, as we were saying, like, part of the balance of a game like this, and, like, Obra Dinn and Golden Isle, is that difficulty is very much in the eye of the beholder. That, again, you can have a puzzle built, like, to your example from Golden Isle, like, figuring out, like, ages of people and math, that someone will just get immediately, and someone else will be like, I have no idea. Just as that person could then solve a puzzle about, I don't know, different pigments in someone's painting that will determine, like, who they are, and someone else being completely stumped with it. In terms of, I guess, like, the other end of the spectrum, in terms of difficulty, how have you decided, like, how hard, like, the hardest room of Surradia should be?
It has a lot to do with sort of building these chains of references where there's a clue in one document that references a second document, and then from that second document it points you to a third document. And these puzzles get exponentially harder the more chains you put in, right? Or the longer the chains are, rather. So I think we're going to see that getting just more steps to how many things you have to put together to get the answer as we go along. But at the end of the day, they don't really scale that linearly because of the limitation that they're tied to the plot, right? So I think we saw this also, in these other games where the hardest room wasn't necessarily the last one. And also there's just so much subjectivity to what you find difficult personally. I had somebody who breezed through my demo who was like, "Oh yeah, that was fun. Spent about 10 minutes a room. Tell me when you make more." And it's like, "How? Who are you?" Right? And then I've had super super smart, cool, interesting people who a big group of them spent like an hour on room 1 and got stumped by it. So it's really, really widely varying how people are going to experience the difficulty. I'm hoping also part of what carries it is just as you go along, your investment in the plot also gets deeper, and so that's going to also carry you through, being more determined at these puzzles, because hopefully you're going to care more and more about just finding out what happens.
Yep. And with going back to talking about the hint system and having hints for players, I guess that's another point that's always a challenge for these games. Some games that I play, they'll give you the straight up answer. If you get stumped long enough, they'll just say, okay, it's this. Put this right here, click this, move on. And some games will do kind of more generic, or they'll try to make the hint a little bit more dynamic to the player. I guess for the hint system for Surradia, how are you approaching, how much you want to kind of nudge the player if they get stumped?
Yeah, right now, I'll probably be building out a kit system that gives you more of the actual answers. Right now, it really just mostly nudges you towards documents that you might not have looked at, or details in those documents you might not have noticed. Something a lot of people didn't notice but makes room 1. You don't need to notice it, but it makes room 1 a lot easier if you notice that the painter is just the guy who has paint on his hands in the picture. So that's the sort of thing that the hint system is pointing out to you. But yeah, looking at it, especially, it's really frustrating for players because nobody goes in wanting to use the hint system right away. So it's really frustrating for players if they get a hint and they feel like it didn't help them. I've made the hints now, they're more contextual. They now actually highlight the field that they're related to. So that at least gives you a base knowledge of this field is incorrect at the current moment, whatever I have in there right now. So that's a little bit more of just concrete information, but I'll probably add maybe a 2-tiered system where first it gives you the, just points you to something you might have missed. And then if you ask for another hint about the same field, it'll just tell you the answer. Because, I really don't want people just walking away because they got stuck.
Yep. And as you were saying, in terms of some not wanting to use the hint system, there will be people, as we all know, who will refuse any kind of hint, approachability option. Do you want to lower the difficulty? They will just keep forcing trying to get it to work.
Yeah, and that's me. I'm that player.
Yeah, me too. And it can be very tricky as a designer, again, in terms of when you just have to step in and just say, okay, you're not solving this. Here's the hint. It's right here. Go, click on this.
Yeah, there's one thing that is an unsolved problem for me in design. And I know that I experienced this when playing these other deduction games, both of them. And that's when the player starts spiraling, right? Which is the player is kind of close to the solution, right? They're off by maybe 2 answers or something. But they're not sure which ones are wrong. And so they just start second guessing everything. And so they go back and change all the stuff that they already had right. And I definitely had rooms in Golden Idol where I was like that. In retrospect, I almost had it finished, but then I just started putting in bizarre stuff that couldn't possibly be right. I don't know, maybe it's this, and that's a bad place for the player to be in. They're not having fun. And it's really hard to recover them from that also, right? And so that's the thing that I don't know how to handle. You kind of almost want the game to actually just jump in and intercede and say, you were closer earlier. But again, you don't want to throw that in at times when players didn't want that, right? If they really wanted to solve it the hard way, you don't want the computer to actually, jump in and hint them in a place where they didn't want it, even if they were way off.
And having that kind of you're on the right track kind of thing. If you put the right name in, it the box gets highlighted or it gets closed off. That's another
Mm,
trick that we see, especially for games that allow you to brute force. That if you're
mm,
just stuck at some people just go, okay, I'm just gonna put everything in Mad Lib style, and okay,
mm.
this one locked in here, so this is good. Let me just put everything about over here. Okay, this one's in. Let me lock down here. And one thing that I noticed with Surradia, kind of like what we saw with Oberdin, is that it's not a case of you can't just lock in like one word or one name. You have to get the entire phrase or the entire kind of like chunk in before the game locks. And correct me if I'm wrong. Did you put something in that like if you're getting close to like solving a block, that the game will kind of like give you an indication?
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna add a little clearer guidance to that because not
Mm-hmm.
everyone is noticing that. But yeah, the background starts getting darker green.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think this type of puzzle, it's a big challenge is balancing not wanting people to be able to brute force with giving them some kind of indication when they're getting closer to being correct, right? Yeah, Obodin had this like you have to solve 3 puzzles at a time, and that's what stopped you from brute forcing it. Um, and Case of the Golden Idol did this thing where um, when you're like within 2 fields of the correct answer,
Mm-hmm.
it'll tell you, you have fewer than 2 mistakes or something like that. And the
Mm-hmm.
trouble with that is it's so tempting to brute force it once you know that,
Yeah.
right? Once you know, like I have a pretty good guess about which one I probably have wrong, so let's just put everything that could possibly go in there. And it's so hard not to do that once they've given you that quantitative information.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been using this green background in the hopes that that's a little bit more qualitative, where it'll give you like, oh, you're getting closer, without giving you like exactly how close you are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's kind of you're getting warmer, you're getting colder. Um, but players haven't found it super helpful so far, so it may be that I need to just do something more concrete like Golden Idol, because it may just be that players just need that concrete of guidance when they're that close. So just to
Mm-hmm.
avoid that spiraling thing where they just
Mm-hmm.
um, kind of give up and jag off and start in just a random direction that's completely wrong.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm trying to think if there's anything else design wise I wanted to ask you because I do want to talk a little bit about like the story and the music, and then we'll kind of start beginning to wrap things up after that. But anything else design wise around about Surradia that we haven't touched on yet that you'd like to bring up?
Design wise, uh, just that I think this type of puzzle is something I'd really like to see more of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's kind of something disappointing about like the detective visual novels, a lot of which I enjoy a lot, but then when it at the end, your big decision is like pick who's the perp out of these 5 people, and you have like a 20% chance of just guessing right at random. Or you can kind of vibes it, like I feel like I don't really totally get what was going on here, but this guy seems kind of shady, so that's going to be my guess. Um, so I really like these deduction style puzzles because they force comprehension, right? You have to
Mm-hmm.
understand what's going on, or you cannot solve the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's just something I'd like to see more of. I'd like to see more puzzles that really force me to comprehend what I'm doing.
Yep. And that I think again is like the challenge of this kind of puzzle design compared to anything else is that it is very much like user defined in terms of like where the difficulty of it's going to come from. If we play like any kind of like more like environmental or kind of like in-game logic puzzle, everyone's coming at that 0. So it is about the game to teach you, okay, the
Mhm.
puffy cloud you can jump on and that creates like smoke. But again, for a game like this, it's a lot harder to get someone or to understand, okay, is this person coming in is going to understand, my music based puzzle? Is this one going to get
Mm.
the different kinds of art style puzzle? And what happens if they don't? And again, like, it's not, you can't expect the game to, provide like a college course on painting
Right.
techniques.
Yeah, yeah, and that's not really what we want anyway.
Hmm.
Yeah. And one thing that really surprised me, it shouldn't have in retrospect, was like the presentation of a clue can drastically affect how people get it and which people get it. So a clue in an image versus the same clue in a document that's text, they use different parts of the brain, right? And so some people will get every clue if it's in an image and just will not get clues hidden in text, and vice versa. So that was something that really surprised me when I noticed that.
Oh, yes. That is definitely one for me. I think, for me, I think I'm a little bit better when it's visual. But, yeah, there are some... And again, like, I'm sure I did that while I was on the stream playing. Like, there are some puzzle clues that I will just, like, laser focus, like, figure out within a second. And then you just have to put up, like, a lighthouse, like, saying, okay, look right there. Look at this point, and there's the clue. And I'll still be like, what? Where are you talking about?
I mean, there were definitely some puzzles like in Myst that were like that for me.
Yes.
Like, I used all the hints and it's telling me just find this object, and I'm staring directly at it and I am not seeing the object.
I still have that story I tell people when I play was a Yuru, the kind of like multiplayer Myst, and they had like pages of hints of like just like different degrees. I'm just like, okay, hint the little one, nope, not getting it. Medium, nope, not getting it. The heavy hint, still not getting it. Okay, here's just the actual puzzle. I'm like, oh, okay, still didn't get it, but here's the solution. All right. I'm trying to think if there's any other questions I had for you gameplay-wise. I think that's about it. I guess anything else that popped into your mind about, like, designing like, the gameplay?
Another thing that was really interesting to me is having more blanks makes the puzzle more exponentially difficult for players, even if some of the blanks are obvious, right? So, for instance, I have several puzzles where you're trying to figure out what spells someone cast, and one of the blanks is just a drop-down list with the names of all the spells, right? Well, if you have the sentence like she cast blank, and that's the puzzle, versus if you have the puzzle go she blanked blank, and the answer to the first one is cast, and that's a gimme, right? It had to be cast because it's a spell. But that makes the puzzle way more difficult. People genuinely struggle with it a lot more if you put in an extra blank, even if there's only one word the blank could possibly be, and it's, and people even figure out that blank really fast, but just the presence of more blanks in the puzzle makes it more difficult.
Yeah, but I've seen that in a lot of like action-driven puzzle games too, especially when you get to like the middle or the late game, where the number of steps required becomes far more higher. Now, those individual steps may be easier. You're still, going from here to there, but having more things to do in between, I think it kind of gives like that, like almost like a feeling of shell-shocked. That, now the game's asking me to do 10 more things instead of 5 more things. Even if those 10 more things are just, what you've done before, what the game has already shown you time and time again. And again, it's also, I think, why we see that kind of like, again, like rubber meets the road moment for a lot of people when it comes to like the churn of, okay, I barely solved this puzzle, and now this puzzle is like 5 times more than that one. My brain's going to explode. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. I yield.
Yeah, it's a cognitive load thing, and of course, you want these to be difficult puzzles, so you want them to have a high cognitive load, but you want to keep that load focused on the interesting bits. And the more of your brain you have to spend keeping track of, like, the unimportant bits that aren't really part of the interesting or aren't really that much of even part of the puzzle, the more you're going to struggle with the actually challenging parts.
Yep. And like we said, if the person is struggling with like the lower challenging parts, they're never going to see like the medium and the high challenging. And sometimes they may leave the game happily because of it. But maybe they got enough of the story they wanted, maybe they've seen enough. But there will always be those people, again, that when they get stuck, the game is dead to them. They will never load it back up again, they will never visit again, they will never check out any DLC. And it's also, I think, to go back to what we were saying earlier about like the adventure game market as a whole, it's why it's so challenging, I think, to grow the market more. That like if you were to show something like Curse of the Golden Eye, or even something like a Wadget Eye or a Sam & Max game to someone who's never touched a point-and-click adventure, they're going to be like, what the heck is this thing? Like, how am I controlling this? Why can't I just walk over there? Why do I have to keep moving things around in my inventory?
Mm-hmm.
And as we said, like there is a hardcore audience for all these games, but it's so difficult, I feel, to like reach out beyond that these days.
It can be, yeah.
Excuse me. 1 second. Allergies and drink going down the wrong hole did not help there. So I guess to kind of move to like the final parts I want to ask you about, in terms of the art, like kind of like the art and the aesthetics of Surradia, how I guess like from like an artistic or an art style standpoint, obviously with a game about being around art, what did you kind of want like the art style to be like for people like watching who may not have looked at the game yet?
Yeah, that was a big challenge because when you're making a game about artists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if I put a newspaper article that says like this artist is really, really good, then if I show you any of his art, it's got to actually be really, really good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm courting a few publishers, not a large number, but a few who I thought might be interested in this. And a big of the reason why is I'd really like to make all the paintings and stuff be actual analog paintings.
Mm-hmm.
Right now they're all digital. But I think that would just add this really cool dimension of like really feeling like you're looking at physical objects. That I can't achieve just by myself because, as it turns out, I am not 6 different brilliant artists.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um,
I'm not even one brilliant artist, so yeah.
yeah.
And
But I do have a lot of digital paintings that are in there, and I was trying to, this game is strongly influenced by surrealism. So, for anyone who's watching who is a fan of surrealism, yeah, we're taking influence from people like Leonora Carrington, like Remedios Varo, like Leonore Feeney. These were all actual real life women who were really interesting and also were really talented artists. And I took different snippets from their lives and kind of inspiration from stuff that really happened to them. It's been fictionalized a lot,
mm-hmm.
but I also took inspiration from their art. So a lot of the stuff in the game definitely borrows from their styles and their themes and ideas.
Mm-hmm. And with coming up with like the different kind of like styles of clues, like as you said, like we have like text-based clues, we have photographs, paintings, journal entries, stuff like that. In terms of like creating like the look of them, so that someone can understand what they're looking at. As you said earlier, like one of the examples you brought was like having like paint on someone's hands in a picture. With kind of balancing like the clues you wanted to tell with the art style, were there any like interesting challenges or decisions you had to make regarding that?
One of the big challenges was photographs,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, as I started thinking about, like, oh, analog paintings would be cool, it became more and more tempting to make more and more stuff analog. Like, let's make them analog letters, let's make them actually written out longhand and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then, like, when there's props, like, oh, here's the one where there's, a toy car. Like, oh, we could get a real toy car and take a photo of it. But you inexorably march towards, there are photos of these people in this exhibit, and I definitely don't have the budget to like hire actors
Mm-hmm.
and rent a whole costume closet and actually stage these photos. So that was kind of where I hit the ceiling of like, we're gonna have to use abstracted depictions at least for the photos. And I was really worried actually that people would have trouble with what's a photo and what's a drawing and what's a painting.
Mm-hmm.
Since the photos are not photorealistic,
Mm-hmm.
they're drawn um, in a more comic book style. They're drawn with black outlines and stuff. Um, I was really worried about that. People have not seemed to have trouble with that because all the drawings and paintings and stuff are done in a very painterly style. They're done with big visible brush strokes and stuff. And that's in large part, yeah, just to make it really, really clear. This is a painting. This was done with a paintbrush. And then people were actually doing a really good job of then understanding that if it doesn't look painterly, then it's meant to be a photograph. It's meant to be something that would be photorealistic if this were a realistic art style, you know.
All right. And with kind of like the narration as well, in terms of like, I guess, how you want the narration to come across in a game like this, were there any decisions you had to make in terms of, I guess, like the tone of the voice, like how much like you want to like add like emotion to the narration, things like that?
Oh my gosh, there was this huge problem, which was, should we have a full voice cast? Because so many of the letters, a key clue is who wrote the letter is a key thing you're trying to figure out. And if we had a full voice cast, people might not always be able to reliably identify individual voices, but they're definitely going to identify, like, is that a male voice or a female voice? And that's just a dead giveaway for a lot of the clues. So we ended up going with just one voice actress, and she's fantastic. But then the question was, the idea is like, this is like, it's a museum exhibit, so this is like, it's the audio tour or something, right? And she's just the narrator of the audio tour. But I was definitely worried, like, are people going to reach the opposite conclusion and think every single one of these documents was written by the same person because they're narrated with the same voice? But so far, nobody's been confused by that. So far, just using the one voice actress and her doing such a very good job is really working well for me, yeah.
Yeah, and to that point, it also goes back to what we were saying earlier about like how people will hone in on different clues based on their own perspectives. So yeah, like again, like if you have a male narrator reading a letter, someone's going to put one and one together there. And again, it's always that challenge of just how much you're telling the player at any given moment. And actually, I think that brings up another question I want to ask you about. In terms of like information, as we've said, like too little information is of course a bad thing for any puzzle game. But there's always that other point about too much information. Like if you give the player 27 different paintings and 15 different notes all in like that same room, people are just gonna be like, oh my god, I'm gonna have to look through all this. Like I'm gonna need like the giant case board with the string on it. Like that can also overwhelm someone just as much as just saying, okay, here's one clue. Figure out 47 different solutions from that one clue. And I guess, for you, like, what are your thoughts on like too much information versus too little?
Yeah, it's a big issue. One thing, for instance, I didn't put in any red herring documents. So every document contains at least one clue to one of the puzzles. There's nothing that's in there either just for flavor, purely for flavor, or just to throw you off the trail. Really, I put in very little that's in there deliberately to throw you off. I was finding that just building those chains of logic is already really challenging for people without there being like false branches to them. I don't think this type of puzzle really needs a lot of things of like, oh, but here's the other thing it could be possibly, but it's not clear. But where was I going with that? Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
No worries.
Oh yeah, too much information. Yeah. A difficult thing with that is like, how much redundancy should you build into solving the puzzles? Now, most puzzles, especially ones that are meant to be challenging, really don't have redundancy, right? Like, if there's a Sokoban, block pushing puzzle, there will be one path you can push the blocks in. And it's generally not considered very good design if there's several paths you can take, all of which, because that's considered to usually make it too easy. I mostly followed that, but it's definitely looking like there's a lot more virtue to having a little bit of redundancy on the more challenging stuff in this type of game. It's looking like, so there is a little bit of redundancy. Often it'll be just something like, there'll be the main clue that's the one you're intended to find, and then there'll be something else that's a little bit more like a hint, like the paint on the fingers. That's just, if you happen to spot that, that'll make it easier, but it's not the main thing you're intended to notice. Like an example is the handwriting in the letters, which is consistent from person to person. But hardly anyone ever just tries to match handwriting to figure out who wrote documents, even though you totally can.
I can tell you I won't be that person either.
No, you're not intended to have to. Yeah. But it's interesting to me the sort of things that people try or don't try, because I kind of expected lots of people to try that, and that's just one example of, like, that's not where people's brains go.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we see from, like, puzzle logic and just, like, in any game in general is that when people, like, one of the hardest things, like, you need to train people on is that if they do A and they get result B, then they will assume that that is the same result every single time they do A. But then there are a lot of puzzle games and a lot of challenges where, no, you could use A and get a completely different result if you do something, if it responds to something else. And trying to train someone to use, like, different puzzle solutions or different kind of puzzle methodology to solve a puzzle is very difficult. And this is something that we see, like, not just like the Soabon style games, but in a lot of, like, environmentally, like, driven puzzle games, like Talos Principle. I know there's another one that I'm forgetting. Portal, I think, would be an example of this as well, where, okay, if you show me that if I do this on a cube, the cube responds like that, but then if I do that on a cube and it doesn't work, or it does something differently, it's like my entire worldview is completely shattered. What am I supposed to do? And there are some people who, they will mess around with things, they will figure out every single trick and manipulation that you can imagine, but for the vast majority of people, it'll kind of feel like, you betray them. Like, if you told me that, water is wet, and now water is dry, or water creates fire, what am I supposed to believe now?
Yeah, like, for instance, The Witness messed me up a bunch of times because, like, sometimes a puzzle will be a switch or something, and sometimes what you'd have to do is solve the line puzzle in a certain way to, like, move a platform. But sometimes they don't do anything, right? Sometimes you just had to find the solution, and and there was really no signaling for which was which.
Oh, yes. Oh, I played another game like that, Taiji, Taiji, and it has the exact same kind of, like, logic where, okay, this time we want you to flip these icons, so, one is white, one is dark. Then we're going to use those same icons in another puzzle, but now it's a completely different logic, and you have no idea, well, okay, I'm flipping them light to dark, but it's not doing anything. No, now you're supposed to be connecting the lines to the light and the dark, and it's supposed to create a pattern. And I'm just sitting there going, what? Like, and I think another part of that, I think some of that I think has kind of like advantage for deductive reasoning, is that for a lot of the more, like, open-ended puzzle games, there is this general assumption the player is going to wander around. They're not going to go, 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. They may go here, to then go over there, to then go over here. And then you run into that issue of, well, what if they miss the intro puzzle to this new logic, and they run into the super advanced version of it, and they're just like, what the hell? Like, I just moved a box from left to right, now you want me to do quantum physics? Where, again, like, with a game like Surradia, Oberdin, and so on, it is built to be, or not so much Return of Oberdin, I think that was also a little bit more on the open-ended side, but something like a Golden Idol, that there is this linearity that does kind of help the player, at least in terms of, okay, I know that if I'm here, all the clues in this section, they are for this puzzle. I don't have to worry about going back to here. I don't need to worry about coming back to this with, like, another clue 10 minutes later. It's all right here. I think that kind of, like, almost like puzzle box or escape room mentality does kind of help things, at least to some extent.
It does help, and also, the amount of variation between the puzzles is kind of a help for this sort of thing too, is because there are going to be a lot fewer times when you've trained the player that they should be looking for one particular thing. And so that helps that there be fewer times when the player feels betrayed because they didn't find the thing that they expected to be there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And like we were saying earlier, like, if the player feels like betrayed like that, they feel like if you've been teaching them to do it like this, and then now the puzzle's like this, a lot of people just be like, what the hell? Like, what was the point of teaching me all this other stuff, but now you're forcing me to do it like this?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's getting back to the like ultimately what we really want is the experience people are getting out of this to be positive. And so ultimately a lot of that is just about looking out for their reactions, looking out for when they feel that way, and being willing to say, like, well, if people are feeling that way on the regular, then I need to go back and rethink what I'm doing.
Yeah. I guess so. One final like gameplay related question for you, and then we'll start to wrap things up. For a lot of these kinds of puzzle games, something that we sometimes see developers do is have kind of like optional puzzles, or like a little bit more advanced things you can try and solve. Maybe they're related, maybe they're not. That game that I mentioned, the one about like finding like the missing family, I think they had like missing or like optional puzzles as well. For something like Surradia, do you have like optional content or optional challenges like that, or is every puzzle slash every room kind of required for like the narrative?
Right now, I don't have a lot of optional stuff. I think that's tricky with a game that's linear.
Yeah.
There are definitely puzzles that could be like the who owns which cat puzzle that I could always flag them and make them optional. I could look into like seeing whether players find that interesting or not. But I think most people who do this game try to be pretty completionist anyway. But it might be nice to do that just for the allowing them to unlock the next room before they have 100% completion.
All right. So I think with that, I'm just about out of questions. I guess anything else regarding Surrey that you want to bring up before we kind of go into like our wrap up?
Just that this sort of game is always a process. So like the demo's out now, but like we are actively, constantly coming back. And sorry, there's someone calling me, and I should have silenced my phone.
That's okay.
Just that I'm actively workshopping these puzzles, even the ones that are already in the demo. So I'm always eager to hear people's feedback and hear like, yeah, were you getting like, was this making you feel smart or was this making you feel stupid? Because we want to make you feel. Why do people think that if I hang up on them once, that I really want to talk to them 1 millisecond later? Sorry, I'm putting it on silent now.
That's all right.
Yeah. So yeah, it's always a process. It's always about honing it and getting it into that perfect state. And so yeah, it's still a work in progress, and that's all informing both the later rooms and just later iterations of the demo that's already out. And what I appreciate is that I definitely feel like I'm learning a ton, and I'm getting way better at writing these puzzles. I'm getting way better at kind of anticipating how people's brains are going to work, what they're going to think of and what they're not going to think of. And that's been really interesting to see and learn.
Yep. And again, like you'll never know, like as you design a puzzle, just how it's going to respond to someone, who's never heard of your game before, trying to figure it out. Because like you say, you'll have that one person who'll just like their brain is just like a decoding machine. They will solve every single thing immediately and go, yeah, that was boring. What else you got? And then you'll have that person who gets stuck on like the very first puzzle for like 2 hours going, I have no idea what I'm looking at. Help me, please.
Yeah, well, it's, that's part of the fun, honestly, as a designer, is seeing the range of people and trying to get like as broad a range of people who can have fun with your thing as possible.
All right, so I think with that, to kind of wrap up our discussion for tonight, for people listening to us, with Surradia, do you have an estimated release date for when it will come out?
Probably sometime in the fall to winter.
Okay. And are you planning on playing it? Obviously, it's going to be on PC. I know you have it on itch as well. Or are you looking at any other platforms for it?
Right now, we're mostly focusing on PC. That really seems to be where the deduction game audience is right now.
Okay. And one question I always like to ask developers, it's always the most stressful question of all. Have you thought about what your next project will be after Surradia?
Actually, I have. Actually, I've got this roguelike deck builder that I'm working on that I'm actually super excited about. I've been working on it a bit in the background, and it's a little creature placement game, and you're going to get points based on their relationships with other creatures and stuff, and it's probably going to be a lot of fun. So I'm actually super excited to work on that one as well.
Yep.
But one thing at a time.
Well, I'll be happy to play that one on stream. Hopefully, not make too much of a
Awesome.
fool of myself when the time comes. All right. I guess with that, my final question for you, Gwen, is you'd like to say to the fans? Any final thoughts on Surradia? Anything to take us out on for tonight?
Well, just thanks a ton for giving me a chance to tell this story. We all just kind of have that thing we want to put out there in the world, and it means a lot to me when you check it out.
All right. So, for you and for Nightwell, anything social media wise you like to mention? Website, Twitter, X, whatever. Go right ahead.
You can find me on most platforms as Gwen Katz. Yeah, I'm on Insta, I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Blue Sky, various other places. And you can find Nightwell Games. It's on Twitter and Blue Sky right now as the places it is.
All right. So, with that, I think we'll wrap things up for tonight. Gwen, thank you again for coming on, and best of luck with wrapping up Surradia.
No, thanks for having me.
All right, so I'm sure we'll have more people again. Late in the afternoon is always tough to get people live, but for anyone enjoying this recorded, thank you for tuning in. If you do have any questions or comments for Gwen, let us know down below. For myself, again, do the YouTubing stuff, check out our Discord and our Patreon. Support will go towards getting more daily streaming happening. Buy as many copies of my books that you see fit. And everyone, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where it's some of the art and science of games. Again, Gwen, thank you so much for coming on, and hopefully we can have you back on in the future to talk about that deck builder.
Totally.
All right. So everyone, have a great rest of your night, and see you all in the next chat.